Get ready for a breathtaking storyline. As a bold gang of thugs humiliates an elderly man in a wheelchair, fate unveils a stunning secret. His son is none other than Jason Statham, and this twist is set to change everything. The grey clouds that hung over Millfield had been there for 3 days, a gloomy canopy that matched Jason Statham's mood as he pulled into his childhood driveway. The Victorian house, once well-maintained with crisp white trim, now stood, weathered and faded, much like the memories he'd left behind years ago. At 42, returning felt like stepping into a faded photograph, familiar yet distorted by time. He killed the engine but remained in the car, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The porch light flickered on, and his father's silhouette appeared in the doorway. Despite his age and confined to a wheelchair, his father maintained a dignified presence that Jason had always admired, even during their years of estrangement. "Just get it over with," he muttered to himself, grabbing his suitcase from the passenger seat. The weight of the medical files inside made it heavier than it should have been. "Jason," his father said as he approached, his name carrying the weight of unspoken conversations. "You look well." "You look tired," he replied, noticing the dark circles beneath his father's eyes. When his father wheeled himself back to let him enter, the house smelled exactly as Jason remembered: old books, pine cleaner, and the lingering scent of motor oil from his father's days as a mechanic. What he hadn't expected was the piano music drifting from the living room, a classical piece his mother had loved. "You still play," he said, his voice catching. "Some things you don't forget," his father answered, "even when you try." The last words hung between them, and Jason felt his carefully constructed defenses begin to crack. He'd come back for one reason only: to convince his stubborn father to take better care of his health after the recent attack in the park. Not for reconciliation, not for forgiveness, just duty, the last thread connecting them. He couldn't have known that returning to Millfield would unravel more than just his plans, forcing him to confront the echoes of a tragedy that had defined them both for far too long. The town of Millfield existed in a curious limbo between past and present. Main Street had been revitalized, with artisanal coffee shops and boutiques catering to weekend tourists, but the surrounding neighborhoods remained frozen in time. Jason noticed this as he drove to the local pharmacy the next morning, passing the park where his father had been attacked just months ago, a thought that still made his blood boil. "Prescription for my father," he told the pharmacist, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. "Oh, Mr. Statham, how's he doing after the incident?" the woman asked, her genuine concern surprising Jason. "He's managing," Jason replied cautiously. "Tell him Carly says hi. He helped me with my college application essays last year. I don't think I would have gotten into Northeastern without him." Jason nodded, trying to reconcile this information with the reclusive father he remembered. "I'll tell him." As he waited, a shadow fell across the counter. "Jason, is that really you?" He turned to find a tall man with kind eyes and a serious demeanor. For a moment, he didn't recognize him. Then it clicked. Michael, his childhood friend, the boy who'd stood by him through difficult times, who'd promised to stay in touch when Jason left town. "Michael," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "you're still here." "Born and raised," he replied with an easy smile. "Though I did manage to escape from medical school, I'm back running my father's practice now. Dr. Michael." The pieces fell into place. He would know about Jason's father's condition. "I'm surprised you recognized me," he said, suddenly self-conscious of the gray strands he hadn't bothered to cover and the lines that had formed around his eyes. "I'd know you anywhere," Michael said simply, and the earnestness in his voice made something twist inside Jason's chest. "How long are you staying?" "Just long enough to help my father recover and set up some protection." Michael's expression shifted. "He told you about what happened then?" "Not willingly," Jason replied. "The hospital called me." "That would be me," Michael admitted. "Your father listed you as his emergency contact, though he made me promise never to use it unless he was seriously hurt," Jason finished. Michael didn't confirm or deny this, but his silence was answer enough. "Maybe we could grab coffee sometime? I could brief you on his condition, strictly professional." Before he could formulate a response, Carly returned with his father's medication. "Here you go, and I've included his favorite lemon drops on the house." Jason thanked her, then turned back to Michael. Coffee would be fine, professional. As he walked away, he couldn't help but feel he'd just opened a door he'd spent years trying to keep closed. The kitchen table had always been neutral territory in the Statham household. During the worst of his mother's illness, when tensions stretched like piano wire between Jason and his father, they'd still manage civility over breakfast. Now, as Jason spread out the medical documents Michael had given him, that same unspoken truce held. "You need to be more careful," he said, tapping the paper. "The doctor says your heart is strong, but at your age, another attack like that could be fatal." His father added another spoonful of sugar to his tea, a habit his wife had always scolded him for. "At my age, careful is a relative term." "It's better than dead," Jason countered. His father's eyes flashed with something like amusement, "always direct, just like your mother." The comparison stung. "Mom would want you to take better care of yourself." "Your mother wanted many things," he said quietly. "Not all of them came to pass." The weight of his words pressed against Jason's chest. They both knew what had gone unsaid, that his mother had wanted her family whole, had begged Jason not to cut ties with his father, had made him promise to try to understand why his father had done what he did. A promise Jason had broken. "This isn't about Mom," he said, gathering the papers. "This is about you being too stubborn to accept help." His father sipped his tea, regarding him over the rim of his cup. "Is that what you think this is?" "What else would it be?" His father set his cup down carefully. "Perhaps I'm simply tired, Jason. Perhaps I don't have the fight left." The blunt admission caught him off guard. He'd prepared for his father's stubbornness, his righteous indignation, even his cold silence. He hadn't prepared for his surrender. "You don't get to quit," he said, his voice hardening. "Not after everything." "Everything," his father echoed. "You mean the attack?" "I mean everything," Jason replied. "The incident at the park, Mom's passing, our estrangement, all of it." His father nodded slowly. "Then perhaps it's time we talked about it." Before Jason could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, he could see a young man shifting nervously on the porch, lanky, maybe early 20s, with headphones around his neck. "That'll be Noah," his father said, wheeling himself toward the door. "He comes every Thursday." "Noah?" "My student," his father explained, as if it were obvious. "Quite gifted. Reminds me of you at that age." As his father went to answer the door, Jason remained frozen in his seat. The house suddenly felt too small, too full of ghosts. He'd need air, space, perspective before he could have this conversation. He left through the back door without saying goodbye, the medical papers forgotten on the table. The cafe on Main Street had once been the town's hardware store. Now, it offered oat milk lattes and gluten-free pastries to a mix of locals and visitors. Jason chose a table by the window, watching raindrops race down the glass while he waited for Michael. He arrived precisely on time, shaking water from his jacket. "Classic New England spring," he commented, sliding into the seat across from Jason. "Sunshine one minute, downpour the next." "Some things never change," Jason replied. "And some things do," Michael countered gently. "You look troubled." Jason wrapped his hands around his mug. "My father wants to talk about everything that happened. I'm not sure I'm ready." Michael's expression softened. He knew the history. Everyone in Millfield had some knowledge of the Statham family's tragedies and tensions. "That's insignificant," Michael said carefully. "He has a student now, a young man named Noah." "Noah," Michael nodded. "Good kid. Been visiting your dad for about 3 years. It's been good for both of them." Jason felt a flicker of irritation. "You seem to know a lot about my father's life." "Small town," Michael shrugged. "And I'm his doctor. And apparently his confidant." Michael leaned forward. "Jason, your father didn't have anyone else. After you left—" "After I left," he interrupted. "He could have reached out at any time. He knew where I was." "Did he?" Michael challenged. "You changed your number, moved twice. When my father died 6 years ago, we tried to contact you. The revelation caught him off guard. I didn't know. I'm sorry about your father. Michael acknowledged this with a slight nod. My point is, your father has been alone for a long time. Noah, a few students from the community college, the book club at the library. That's his life now. Book club? Jason couldn't hide his surprise. Thursday evenings. He's become quite the literature enthusiast. Your father leads the discussion. The image was so at odds with the stern, withdrawn man he remembered that Jason almost laughed. Who are you talking about? My father hated fiction, said it was a waste of time. People change, Michael said simply. Loss changes them. The unspoken accusation hung between them. Loss had changed Jason too, hardened him into something brittle and defensive. The attack in the park, he said, redirecting. Tell me honestly, how serious was it? Michael considered the question. It could have been much worse. 3 men targeting an elderly man in a wheelchair, if a passerby hadn't scared them off. He shook his head. But physically, he's recovered. Well, it's the emotional impact I'm more concerned about. What do you mean? I think he feels his dignity was taken from him. For a man like your father, who's always prided himself on his strength and independence, that's devastating. Jason's jaw tightened. If I ever find the men who did this, you'll what? Beat them up? Get yourself arrested? Michael's voice was gentle but firm. What your father needs now isn't vengeance, Jason. It's connection. It's family. Jason's laugh was sharp. 15 years too late for that. Michael didn't flinch. Is it? Because you're here now and so is he. Seems like the universe is giving you both another chance. I don't believe in chances, Jason said, gathering his things. I believe in facts, and the fact is, my father needs better security and someone to check on him regularly. That's all this visit is about. As he stood to leave, Michael caught his wrist gently. One more fact then. What happened between you two wasn't just your father's fault. It wasn't yours either. It was a tragedy, Jason. Nothing more, nothing less. He pulled away, suddenly cold, despite the cafe's warmth. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Michael's eyes held his. I was there too, remember? Through all of it. Of course he had been. Everyone in Jason's life seemed to be a witness to his worst moments. Tomorrow, he said, abruptly changing the subject, I'll bring him to your office tomorrow for a full checkup. He left before Michael could respond, stepping into the rain, without bothering to open his umbrella. When Jason returned to the house, he found his father in the living room, fingers moving slowly over the piano keys. The melody was unfamiliar, something original perhaps, with a melancholy that made his chest ache. That's new, he said, announcing his presence. His father's hands stilled. Something I've been working on, for Noah's recital next month. Jason moved closer, noting the sheet music on the stand, handwritten, the notes precise and deliberate. You're composing again. Just arranging, he corrected. Noah found a piece he liked, but it was too advanced. I simplified it for him. Like you used to do for me, Jason said, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. When he'd struggled with difficult pieces, his father had always found ways to make them accessible without diminishing their beauty. His father's smile was sad. You never needed simplifying, Jason. You just needed patience. The comment, innocuous as it was, brushed against old wounds. I made an appointment with Michael for tomorrow, 9 a.m. for a follow-up exam. His father sighed, closing the piano lid. I suppose I should thank you. Don't thank me. Just be ready on time. He turned to leave, but his father's voice stopped. Him. I found something last year, the medallion that was taken during the attack. The police recovered it. Jason felt his throat constrict. I thought it was lost for good. So did I, his father said simply. It seems some things find their way back, even when we think they're gone forever. For a moment, Jason was tempted to ask more about the medallion, about what really happened that night in the park, about the years of silence between them. But the moment passed, hardening into resolve. "I have work emails to answer," he said. "I'll be in the guest room." As he climbed the stairs, he could feel his father's gaze following him, heavy with unspoken words. The weight of their shared history pressed down, making each step an effort of will. The guest room had once been his, though little evidence remained of the teenager who'd lived there. The walls, once covered with posters and photographs, were now a neutral beige. The desk where he'd studied was replaced by a simple writing table. Only the window seat remained, with its view of the backyard and the old maple tree where he had built a treehouse when they were children. Jason sat at the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. He hadn't expected Millfield to affect him this. Ewesa hadn't expected the memories to be so vivid, the pain so fresh. He'd constructed a life precisely to avoid this feeling, this constant awareness of absence. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, asking about a client presentation. The normalcy of the question was jarring. A reminder of the life that continued without him. Jason began to type a response, then stopped, looking out at the maple tree swaying in the evening breeze. For the first time in years, his carefully constructed walls began to crumble. The dream came as it always did, fragments at first, then, with terrible clarity. The argument with his father, his mother's illness, the slamming door, Jason frozen in indecision, unable to bridge the gap. The phone call months later, the hospital corridors sterile and bright, the doctor's face grave and sympathetic. Jason woke gasping, sheets tangled around his legs. For a disorienting moment, he was younger again, receiving the news that would cleave his life in two before and after. A soft knock at the door pulled him back to the present. "Jason, are you all right? I heard..." His father's voice concerned. "I'm fine," he called, hating the tremor in his voice. "Just a dream." A pause. "I could make tea." The offer, so simple, so parental, made his throat tighten. "No, thank you. I'm going back to sleep." He listened as his father's wheelchair moved back down the hall, then reached for his phone. 3:17 a.m., too early to call anyone, where it would be just past midnight. He was alone with his thoughts, adrift in the house where everything had fallen apart. Almost without conscious decision, Jason found himself rising, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders, and making his way down the hall to his father's study. The door was closed as it had been for years. His hand hesitated on the knob. Would it even be unlocked? Had his father preserved it as a shrine or repurposed it entirely? The door opened silently, revealing a room transformed. Gone was the cluttered desk, the bookshelves crammed with technical manuals. In their place stood a small upright piano, a comfortable reading chair, and walls lined with framed photographs, family photos, professionally mounted. It was neither shrine nor erasure, but something in between. A space where memory lived, alongside present purpose. Jason approached the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. How many hours had his father spent here, working through his thoughts? How many times had Jason walked past this room, hearing music, but never entering? A leather-bound album sat on the piano bench, its edges worn with use. Jason picked it up, holding it like something fragile and precious. The pages were filled with family photographs, moments of joy and celebration interspersed with quieter times. Jason flipped through them, his eyes catching images of holidays, birthdays, ordinary, days made extraordinary by their preservation. Photos of his mother, healthy and smiling. Photos of himself as a child, looking up at his father with undisguised admiration. He paused at a photograph he'd never seen before. It showed himself and his father, arms around each other at his college graduation. A moment he'd forgotten, entirely in the haze of subsequent estrangement. Behind the photo was a handwritten note in his father's precise script. "Jason, if you're reading this, you've finally come home. I've thought about what I would say to you 1,000 times, and none of it seems adequate. Words have never been my strength. Actions were always how I showed love. Perhaps that was my greatest failure as your father. I want you to know that I never blamed you for leaving. After your mother's passing, I became someone even I didn't recognize. The grief transformed me into a man who couldn't express what he felt, who pushed away the one person who mattered most. I'm sorry for the years we've lost, but know that not a day has passed that I haven't been proud of you, haven't loved. You haven't hoped for reconciliation. Your father. Jason sat heavily on the piano bench, the album clutched to his chest. The words broke through defenses he'd spent years constructing. The realization that his father had been waiting, hoping, preparing for this moment all along, broke something open inside him, a dam holding back years of grief. Jason wept silently, shoulders shaking, as dawn began to lighten the sky outside. His father was already dressed when Jason came downstairs at 7, the album tucked under his arm. He sat at the kitchen table, methodically arranging pills beside a glass of water. "You found it," he said without turning around, his voice carefully neutral. "Why didn't you ever send this to me?" Jason asked, placing the album on the table. "It might have changed everything." His father took his medication before answering. "Pride, perhaps, fear, certainly. I convinced myself you needed time, that you would come back when you were ready." He shook his head. "I was a coward." "You?" Jason hadn't expected this admission. "You were never afraid of anything." "I was afraid of losing you," his father said simply. "And in trying to protect myself from that fear, I ensured it came to pass." The stark honesty caught Jason off guard. He'd prepared for his father's stubbornness, his righteous indignation, even his cold silence. He hadn't prepared for his vulnerability. "I owe you an apology, Jason," his father began. "After your mother's illness, I became fixated on maintaining control. I convinced myself that if I remained strong, disciplined, nothing else could hurt us. I pushed you away." "We both know that," Jason said, fighting to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Yes, but what I didn't understand, what I didn't allow myself to see, was how that affected you." The statement caught him off guard. "Me?" His father nodded. "You were always the one who felt things deeply, who wasn't afraid to show emotion. I misinterpreted that as weakness, when in fact it was your greatest strength. And then, after your mother died, I was too lost in my own grief to see yours." The simple acknowledgement of his pain, his experience, his loss, was more than Jason had expected. For years he'd carried the conviction that his father thought less of him for his emotional nature, for not being as stoic, as unflappable. "I thought you were disappointed in me," he admitted, the words barely audible. His father's eyes widened in genuine shock. "Jason, no, never. I was in awe of you, of your capacity to feel, to connect. I envied it, if I'm honest. It was a gift from your mother that I couldn't claim. And yet you pushed me away when I needed you most." "I know," his father said gently. "That's what I've been trying to reconcile all these years. That perhaps the greatest disservice I did to your mother's memory was failing the son she loved so dearly." The simplicity of it, the frank admission of failure without excuse, was both devastating and liberating. "The attack in the park," Jason said, changing course. "Tell me what really happened." His father looked out the window, where the morning suns illuminated the garden. 3 men, young but not teenagers. They wanted money, of course, but I think they also wanted power. The medallion was just an opportunity. Taking it from an old man in a wheelchair made them feel strong. "That's why you refused to file a full police report," Jason realized. "You were ashamed. Not of being attacked," his father clarified, "but of how it affected me afterward. The fear, the helplessness. Emotions I'd spent a lifetime avoiding suddenly overwhelmed me. I didn't know how to handle them. So you shut down, withdrew." "It's what I've always done," his father admitted, "until Noah started coming around. That boy, he has no patience for self-pity. Reminds me of you." Jason felt a smile tugging at his lips despite himself. "You've changed." "Necessity," his father replied, "though perhaps not enough. Not soon enough." The question hung between them, unanswerable yet demanding response. "Mom would say it's never too late to change," Jason finally replied. His father's smile was sad but genuine. "She would, wouldn't she? Your mother was the best of us." "She wanted us to reconcile," Jason said, remembering his mother's final request. "I promised her I'd try. And have you? Tried? Jason considered the question honestly. No. Until now, I haven't been ready. And now? He met his father's gaze directly. I don't know, but I'm here, aren't I? That's something. His father nodded, accepting this partial answer. The appointment with Michael, I'll go. Thank you, Jason said, relieved. As they prepared to leave, his father paused at the door. Regardless of what happens with my health, Jason, I want you to know something. These past few days having you here, it's more than I hoped for. The simple statement, free of expectation or demand, touched Jason more deeply than he was prepared for. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and followed his father out to the car. Michael's office was warmer than Jason expected, with landscape paintings on the walls and comfortable chairs, instead of the sterile examination rooms he was accustomed to in larger cities. While his father underwent tests, Jason waited, flipping through magazines without registering their content. He's in good hands, a voice said, startling him. Michael stood in the doorway, white coat over casual clothes. The exam takes about 30 minutes. Will he need ongoing care? Jason asked. Michael shook his head. Not medically, no. He's remarkably resilient for his age. But socially, emotionally, that's another matter. Jason nodded, grateful for his friend's honesty. Thank you for calling me, for looking after him. I should have said that earlier. You're welcome, Michael said, taking the seat beside him. For what it's worth, he talks about you all the time. Your career, your achievements. He even keeps newspaper clippings when your security firm makes the news. The revelation surprised him. How would he even know where to look? I might have helped with that, Michael admitted. After my father died, your dad was one of the few people who really understood what I was going through. We became friends, I suppose. He showed me your mother's photo albums, told me stories about when you were young. Jason tried to imagine his stern father sharing family memories with Michael, and failed. It's hard to picture. Grief changes people, Jason. Sometimes it makes them harder, sometimes softer. Your father became both. Before he could respond, a nurse appeared. Dr. Reed, we're finished with Mr. Statham. Michael stood. I'll go over the results with him. Would you like to join us? Jason nodded, following him through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and coffee. His father sat in the examination room, adjusting himself in his wheelchair. He looked small against the medical equipment, vulnerable in a way that made Jason's chest tighten. Well? He asked Michael. The good news is that there's no lasting damage from the attack, Michael explained. Your father is in excellent health, all things considered, but I do have concerns about his living situation. Jason's father looked up, sharply. What do you mean? I'm concerned about your safety, living alone, Michael said gently. The attack in the park was random, but it highlights your vulnerability. Jason's father's jaw tightened. I'm not moving to a facility. I wasn't suggesting that, Michael assured him. But perhaps some additional security measures or regular check-ins. The practical suggestion hung in the air. Jason felt the weight of implication, the pull of his carefully constructed life across the country, the demands of clients who depended on him. I can arrange for security, he heard himself say, and I can stay for a few weeks at least, set up a better system. His father's expression, surprise mingled with cautious hope, made him realize how rare it must be for him to hear Jason choose family over work. Are you sure? He asked. Yes, Jason said, and was surprised to find he meant it. I'm sure. As Michael outlined his recommendations, Jason felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, but possibility. The chance for a different ending than the one he'd scripted years ago. The park where his father had been attacked was beautiful in the spring sunshine, with daffodils pushing through the soil and trees budding with new life. Jason pushed his father's wheelchair along the path, hyper-aware of their surroundings in a way he hadn't been before. It happened right here, his father said, gesturing to a bench beneath an old oak tree. I was sitting watching children play. Never saw them coming. Jason's jaw tightened. They took advantage of your vulnerability. My dignity, his father corrected. That's what hurt the most. Not the few bruises, not the stolen medaillon. The feeling that I was no longer a man to be reckoned with, but an old person to be pitied or exploited. The honesty of the admission struck Jason. For the first time, he truly understood what the attack had meant to his father. Not just a poor, physical assault, but an assault on his very identity. I understand that, Jason said softly. More than you might think. His father looked up at him, questioning. When Mom died, Jason continued, forcing the words out, I felt diminished, like I'd lost not just her, but a piece of myself. And when you and I fought, when I left, I lost another piece. I've spent 15 years trying to rebuild myself around those absences. And have you succeeded? His father asked, his voice gentle. I built a life, Jason replied, a career. But there's always been this emptiness, this sense that something fundamental was missing. His father nodded, understanding in his eyes. For me, too. They continued in silence for a time, the spring breeze carrying the scent of new growth and possibility. Eventually, they stopped by a small pond, where ducks swam lazily in the afternoon light. I've been thinking, Jason said finally, about work, about my life back home. His father nodded, waiting. I've been offered a chance to expand my security firm, he continued. It would mean more responsibility, more travel. Congratulations, his father said, genuine pride in his voice. You've earned it. I'm considering turning it down. His father's surprise was evident. Why would you do that? Jason looked across the park, gathering his thoughts. Because I'm not sure it's what I want anymore. I've spent years building a life designed to be as different from here as possible. But being back, seeing how things have changed, how you've changed, he trailed off. I'm not saying I want to move home permanently, but I'm not sure I want to keep running away either. His father considered this. What would you do instead? Don't know yet, Jason admitted. That's what scares me. For the first time in my adult life, I don't have a 5-year plan. His father chuckled softly. Welcome to the human condition, my son. They fell silent again, watching the ducks navigate the pond with effortless grace. From somewhere nearby came the sound of children laughing, a reminder of life continuing its cycle regardless of personal drama. Whatever you decide, his father said finally, know that you have a home here, not just a house, but a home if and when you want it. Jason nodded, throat tight with emotion. I spoke with the security company yesterday. They're installing a new system at the house tomorrow. His father smiled. Always the protector. It's what I do, Jason protested. It's who you are, his father corrected gently, and it's something I've always admired about you. As they made their way back toward the car, Jason placed a hand on his father's shoulder, a simple gesture of connection that would have been unthinkable days ago. His father reached up, covering Jason's hand with his own. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. The past remained with all its pain and regret, but alongside it grew something new, the tentative roots of understanding, the slow unfurling of respect. In this park where dignity had been taken, father and son found a measure of it restored, not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity.